Welcome to this episode of Earth Talks. India is set to experience the largest increase in energy demand of any country worldwide over the next 20 years. Now, this raises the question of how best to meet the swelling energy demand while also staying committed to low carbon pathways. I have two special guests today with me. One is joining me from Paris, another one from New Delhi. And they're going to help me unravel how do we balance out this dichotomy. Peter Zanaisky, he's the energy analyst at the IEA. Lou Del Bello, she's an editor with the Third Pole. She also runs a newsletter on climate and energy issues. It's called Lights on India. If you haven't subscribed to it already, please do. Peter, my first question to you. Firstly, many congratulations on the report. It's a fantastic report, very comprehensive. It's called the India Energy Outlook 2021. Now, here's a report that states our future prosperity will rest on our ability to produce clean and green energy. And I was intrigued by the different scenarios it maps out in terms of India's future energy demands. But Peter, before I get into the challenges, take our viewers through the major highlights of this report.
Certainly. Thank you, Bahar, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think to start off with, I mean, it's important to recognize just how many sort of achievements India has made in the last sort of 5 years. So at the IEA, we did our original report on India, the long-term outlook, back in 2015. And since then, we've seen huge advances, huge strides in energy access, electricity in particular. You know, we've seen a huge amount of deployment of renewable energy, especially solar power, which has just ran ahead of all our expectations earlier, and so on. So there's numerous achievements that India's made. And so we set our analysis really in that context of, an economy that's really arisen very strongly in the international energy scene. And of course, as you say, India is the third largest energy consumer in the world. And so how it meets energy demand going forward, particularly as the country industrializes and urbanizes, there's going to be a huge shift towards cities. You know, how do we manage all that? And how do we, get the sort of energy resources that we need? And so one of the things that we highlight is, of course, energy demand will grow very, very strongly. So as you say, it's India is the largest source of energy demand growth in our global scenarios. It accounts for something like a quarter of all global energy demand growth. So that's a huge amount of additional growth coming through. And so how those services are met is really essential, not just for India and for energy access and alleviating energy poverty, but for the world as well. And I'm sure we'll come back to that theme later on in the show. But just that's the overall context in which we assess India's energy policy choices going forward.
Right. And I noticed that there were these different scenarios that were outlined in the report. So take us to them, because what I find intriguing, I have to say, about this report is that it's very optimistic. And that's great. It's fantastic. It sounds like this is the sunshine time when it comes to renewable energy. And it's good to hear that it's almost at par with coal. So that's good news. But obviously, it'll take us a while before we reach that low carbon pathway, or when India, phases out coal completely. So what are these different scenarios and how do we get there?
Yeah, no, indeed. And so in our scenario, so we followed three main scenarios in this report: the stated policy scenario, the sustainable development scenario, and we also considered the India vision case. So all three of those scenarios kind of reflect different assumptions about the pace of growth in India. Underlying drivers like GDP growth are stronger, for example, in the India vision case than in the stated policy scenario. You say it's very optimistic, and I'm glad that you say that, but equally there's a lot of underlying analysis about the impacts, for example, from the pandemic, the slowdown in energy investment, and so on. So there are a lot of challenges, and implementation obviously is a big challenge for these longer term targets. So we do say that. But in our stated policy scenario, which is our sort of central scenario reflecting India's current policies and where they want to take the energy system, we still have huge amounts of oil demand growing. India is the largest source of oil demand growth. We have huge amounts of coal. Coal production is increasing. The government has coal production targets. So that, the fossil fuels are there, as an anchor for our scenarios. And indeed, natural gas rises very, very strongly as well. It's the fastest growing market, India, for natural gas globally as well. But, then we explore the renewable side. And, a lot of our projections are underpinned by government targets. So the target to reach 450 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2030, things like that are reflected. And of course, that throws up huge amounts of challenges for the energy system as a whole, but also the power system specifically. So, we highlight how India's flexibility requirement becomes the largest in the world as well, because you have this solar energy coming through very strongly, at 12 o'clock. And then you have a early evening, late evening peak in residential air conditioning demand. And, we see huge amounts of air conditioning growth in units and ownership, something like 700 million by 2040. So those are huge underlying factors to chew through as we go through, how things are affecting the fuel demand in India.
That was actually my second question, but I think what I find very, for me, the headline moment really was, and I think you briefly touched on it, was the fact that if we pursue the sustainable development pathway, it doesn't negatively impact the GDP. In fact, it makes it better. Am I right in that interpretation? Because there seems to be this assumption that if you pursue sustainable development, it's going to have a negative impact on our GDP. So could you unpack that for us, please?
Sure. So in our STEPS and SDS scenario, GDP outcomes are the same, broadly speaking. So, the argument is that, the ambitions, where policy takes us today, and the difference between that and the sustainable development scenario, where we work backwards to reach sort of global targets, we explore that gap. And in the case of India, there really isn't a huge difference, or in fact, there's no difference in the GDP assumption for a number of reasons. And one of those key ones that we sort of highlight in the analysis is that there's a huge import bill facing India as it grows its oil demand. And that import bill is effectively lowered quite substantially in the SDS because there's less demand for oil as India, electrifies transportation networks and so on, and improves energy efficiency, especially in industry. So that brings the oil import bill down quite considerably, and that matches, in fact, the additional investment requirement in clean energy technologies. So, India becomes the largest market for battery storage, becomes a huge market for solar, a big market for even emerging technologies as well. And so all that amounts to something like an $80 billion market per year in the SDS. So that's a huge, clean energy system that needs a lot of investment, a lot of jobs, and so on. So that's what offsets, a lot of the other impacts related to following that transition.
All right, a lot of job creation there, a lot of low-hanging fruits there as well, but obviously it's not easy to get to that path. Lou, I must draw you into the conversation now as somebody who reports on these issues, who studies them in a lot of detail. What did you make of this report, and how realistic do you think it is in terms of its analysis?
Well, obviously I thought it was very interesting. It was, I think the agency did another report, but it's a while back, so it was a really great update, giving a good idea of the state of play and some very clear messages. There's this iconic graph with the solar going up and coal going down and meeting in the middle around 2040, so that was a very iconic figure. I do feel overall, because these numbers are so stark, that sometimes some caveats are buried in the message. So, for example, all the challenges that we were mentioning before, like the problems with integration of renewable energies in a grid that is basically built to circulate fossil fuels. And so all the success of these scenarios will depend on whether India is able to achieve all of that. So to modernize the grid, to make space for renewable energy, and to some degree, from a reporter's perspective, I also wonder, when we talk about energy transition, we obviously imagine adding a lot of renewables and increasing flexibility in the grid. But what about factors like social factors like jobs? At the moment, India has, I think, 500,000 coal-related jobs. And I wonder how many of these jobs can be, converted in clean energy-related jobs. Like, you can't necessarily put all the miners or, all the people that work in that sector, giving them another job. So it's a wide variety of big challenges, and I feel obviously the speed reports offer a path forward, but we must remember as we study them that these are scenarios and are not predictions, and we have to also keep into account all of that that stands in the way. There could be social factors. It could be as simple as after the COVID crisis, people want to, we're starting building more homes and more buildings, but because people are poorer, maybe they would choose materials that are not as good, and houses will not be that well insulated, or people will go for ACs that are not very energy efficient. All of that adds up when we're talking about hundreds of millions of people. So I think, it's an interesting signal, and it's something that is quite inspiring, but the reality of it will unfold year by year in the next few decades.
Yes, Lou, and I'm glad you underlined that it's not a prediction, it's scenarios on what could possibly happen. And yes, that's absolutely true. And I'm glad that you brought the focus on coal, because coal is always contentious. To be fair to the report, it does mention that if India has to move away from coal, then people will, those people who depend on coal will have to be assisted in terms of finding jobs. But how that is to happen, I think the report is silent on that. But Peter, coal-fired power plants, it does paint a scenario where these are being, if they were to be, phased out, and we seem to be moving towards that. My concern is that while standalone plants currently under construction, completed over the next few years, we may not be commissioning any new ones. But what about captive plants which are attached to the steel and the cement industry, for instance, that are again the foundation for our infrastructural growth? Would that not, because of these captive plants, would our dependence on coal continue for a very long time?
Yeah, excellent question. And also, Lou, your takeaways on the report were also very interesting and fully appreciated. So indeed, yes, coal, it's a bit of a bugbear, especially with modeling, captive power plants, because a lot of these are legacy plants that were built because of the grid reliability issues, or simply no access to the grid at times, and so there's this huge I think it's 75 gigawatts, which is one of the largest sort of captive power capacities in the world in India, and a huge amount of that is met by coal. So in our India Vision case, we explore where gas can go, because there's ambitious plans to reach a gas-based economy in India, and a huge infrastructure program to get CGD networks in the ground and so on. And so part of that vision, we see as gas stepping in to replace coal-fired captive power. For example. Now, obviously it's hugely ambitious, and there's well-known issues about, the competitiveness of gas-fired power generation and so on. So what we also sort of qualify that with is to say that, you need the network investments and the grid investments to be in place, and for a tariff structure that, really socializes the costs across the grid users and so on. And we also make assumptions that gas is, becomes a bit more competitive as it sort of gets rolled into the GST, the goods and service tax, and so on. So there's those assumptions that underpin that, but that's maybe one route to reducing coal. Another one is battery systems with solar power, for those smaller applications, for the captive segment. which is really based on diesel. You know, a huge amount of diesel generators could be replaced by those smaller scale sort of microgrids and solar PV with paired with battery storage, which we see growing in terms of competitiveness. So, you know, one of our highlights is that by 2030, you know, solar and batteries together will become competitive against existing coal. So that's a huge finding. It really shows how much things are turning around. You know, and a lot of that is the global reduction in costs, but also just it's becoming more expensive to run coal-fired power plants, and it's just much more uncertain now. You know how this you know how this sort of dynamic will play out. But certainly, you know, there's an abundance of coal capacity, a big sort of pipeline of projects. So, you know, we're watching that closely to see how everything sort of pans out.
That's very interesting, Peter. And from coal, I apologize. From coal, let me discuss hydropower because I think that's another hugely controversial subject, and especially in the backdrop of what played out in, you know, in Uttarakhand, the tragedy which happened. I spoke to a lot of experts, and I know that while we're unraveling, you know, the causes, was it a GLOF event? Was there, you know, a glacier which was melting very rapidly? I mean, I think all that is still being analyzed by the climate scientists, but every expert I spoke to in the area said that the impact of what happened in, you know, in Uttarakhand was exacerbated by the construction of the dams, the cascade of dams that are being constructed on the rivers there. Now, Lou, I want to ask you, as an India watcher, as somebody who understands the energy debate here, as somebody who's again been reporting on it, very conveniently, hydro is put in this basket of clean energy. Would you agree with that? Would you agree with this classification that hydro is a clean source of energy? Clean and green, I should say.
I think it's very interesting. It kind of ties to what we just said about looking at the potential numbers and looking at the reality on the ground. So hydropower has the potential to deliver a lot of green energy, but also if we see on the ground how the plans of the government are, you know, panning out, there are a lot of these big plans built in areas that are unsafe, for example. The capital cost is huge, so it remains to be seen if investors feel comfortable investing in something that could have potentially could face a lot of protests, a lot of unrest in the site itself, could face a lot of cost down the line, because if it's obviously a big dam, we're talking about big structures built somewhere where, you know, the ground might not be that stable, then, you know, it becomes a lot of money that could be potentially lost. So, for example, what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir now after the, you know, this big push to open the region for business and, you know, promote the development of the region, also using hydropower. The region has a lot of hydropower potential. Seems like a good idea to invite businesses to invest. It's a clean energy source, etc., etc. But in reality, all of these plans always seem to stall, and it's something that's been going on for a long time. And now there have been very recently, I think, new permits, which will involve cutting a lot of trees. So already people are not happy about it. But my impression is that probably it would be difficult to find businesses that are willing to invest in that. So all this big, you know, energy potential is factored in the government projections. So they say, oh, we're going to have that much hydropower by that date. But whether this is going to happen, it's another question. And I think, you know, the government is being a bit optimistic.
Yes. So I think what you're saying to me is there are political reasons, there are social reasons why hydro is being pushed. A lot of these hydropower dams are, of course, also on our border areas. So there is a need to have control over the natural resources. But I, you know, as an environmentalist who's traveled through these areas, I have to say that we tend to forget that the forests that will be submerged and, you know, the methane emissions, all that I think doesn't get accounted for. And our image of hydro, I think, needs, you know, a change, because is it as green as we make it out to be? I'm not sure, but I'm just putting it out there. But okay, we're almost at the end of our discussion here. But I always like to go with some key takeaways, which is that if a policymaker were to enter the room right now, Peter, you in particular, what would you, because you have this report, what would you say to that policymaker in terms of what India needs to do, the top 3 things that India needs to do to pursue a low carbon pathway? And Lou, I am going to ask you the same question as well as a final wind up. Peter, to you first.
Thank you, Bahar. And I mean, as part of the IEA, officially, my job is to give out projections and scenarios and to show policymakers the consequences of their actions. In the World Energy Outlook, we're not as big on policy recommendations. That's for governments to look at. But I can tell you what the takeaways for me are, from this report, having sort of intensively studied India, the whole system over the last sort of year, and it's a fascinating subject, of course. And one of the key things that comes out of our modeling is that the majority of emissions in India by 2040 will come from things that don't exist today. So buildings, factories, vehicles, all the stock of infrastructure that emits carbon and other emissions don't exist today. So I guess that means that India has a huge opportunity ahead, in the context of where we are now globally, with the climate change dialogue, with COP26, with the momentum around this. There's clearly an opportunity there for India to sort of capitalize on that momentum and recognize that, charting a way forward involves not just addressing its existing stock of emissions. We mentioned coal, which is a big one, but, to face the future, thinking ahead about clean energy technologies. And that's the kind of key message I would try and put through. And just, as an adjunct to that, it's industry, it's the hard to abate sectors, it's stuff that needs new technologies and new approaches. So, India can really pioneer a low carbon development model that could serve as an inspiration to many other sort of emerging and developing markets globally. So I'll leave it at that and let policymakers take care of the rest.
Okay, Peter's taken the diplomatic way out. He's only giving us takeaways, but fair enough. Those are good takeaways. Lou, what would you say to a policymaker? Maybe you can be less diplomatic as a journalist.
I would say maybe it's never going to be a final solution. It's a big problem. There have to be a concerted effort from many actors and from many parts of the problem. But I would say I see, as I report on these issues, I see this government is very keen on big projects, big infrastructure, things that will make the headlines or massive targets. And sometimes it almost feels like issues that are more local and such as, for example, decentralized energy generation are forgotten in favor of, let's say solar. We will have massive deployment of large utility scale solar, but rooftop solar is currently lagging behind, and there's so much potential there. But difficult policy squabbles almost between states, between distribution companies and power producers. There's a lot of that at the moment, and this really penalizes what would be a low-hanging fruit for the energy transition. And the same, the discussion we're saying before for hydropower. Obviously, you have this massive hydropower. If you got hydropower somewhere where it's a fragile environment with, vulnerable biodiversity, then it's bound to create problems. So I would say sometimes looking at the local dimension and understand how communities, how cities, how states can respond to the challenge and can rise to the challenge, I think would be, something that could yield very positive results.
No, I agree with you, Lou, and I find it that's very insightful. But because there is an obsession with large projects, and again, I like Peter's point as well, where he says that most of our infrastructure is yet to be built, and can we make it decentralized? Can we make it low cost? Can we make it low carbon. And rather than seeing that as something very daunting and overwhelming, if we see that as an opportunity, then I think that the low carbon pathway becomes a very exciting road to travel down. So I'm going to thank you so much to both of you for joining me. I want to end by quoting from the report, in fact, as it says that the world seeks ways to accelerate the pace of transformation in the energy sector. India is in a unique position to pioneer a new model for low carbon inclusive growth, as Peter was just pointing out. And I can just add that let's hope this happens sooner than later. Thank you, both of you, for joining me today on Earth Talks. As always,
Thank you very much.
Zeno, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.